3 cars passed her that night. Not one of them slowed down. Adeline Rourke was 27 years old, lying on the wet stone outside a wrought iron gate on Blackthorn Hill. Rain coming down so hard it filled her mouth every time she tried to breathe. Her delivery jacket had torn open along one side. The last package on her route had rolled into the drainage channel, just out of reach of her hand. And even then, even lying there in the dark, she was still reaching for it. Not because it mattered, because a lost package meant money off her paycheck. And by then, that was how she'd been taught to think. Not about her ribs. About the money. 3 hours earlier, the man she was supposed to marry had told her to be out of the apartment by 10. She had a few crumpled bills in her wallet, a blue notebook in her jacket pocket, and 9 weeks of something growing inside her that nobody in the world had said they wanted. So she lay there, and she watched the taillights disappear, one after another, and she thought, so this is how it ends. Then a fourth set of headlights swung across the hill and stopped. A door opened. Boots came through the water fast, and a man went down on one knee beside her in a soaked black overcoat, white shirt open at the collar, an old watch on his wrist. He didn't ask if she was all right. He put his hand on her side and pressed down, hard and certain, the way a man does when he's done this before. And when he spoke, his voice never rose at all. He told her to look at him. He told her not to close her eyes. And Adeline, who'd spent the better part of a year learning that nobody was ever coming, looked up at a stranger in the rain and used the last breath she had, not to ask him to save her, but to whisper 2 words about the baby. She had no idea who'd just knelt down beside her. She had no idea that 7 blocks of this city stood up when that man walked past, and that they didn't stand up out of respect. She couldn't have known that the car which almost ran her down on that road had come from behind those very gates, or that it had stopped at the top of the hill before it ever turned around. All she knew was that it was raining, and that for the first time in a very long time, somebody had stopped. If stories like this one move you, please take a second to hit that like button and share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still exists. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. Now let's go back to that road outside the gate and find out what really happened after she closed her eyes. 3 hours earlier, the apartment on Waterman Street had still been warm. Adeline stood beside the stove, reheating the last portion of cold rice left in the refrigerator, something she had saved from the day before yesterday and planned to stretch into 2 meals. Her phone was propped at an angle beside the salt shaker, its screen glowing as it recorded a voice note for her night shift because both of her hands were busy. She had a habit of reading addresses into her phone while she cooked, then listening to them again later when she was in the car. The bubbling water drowned out every other sound in the kitchen, so when Travis's phone vibrated on the table, she heard it clearly. She hadn't meant to look. Later, when she was lying in the rain and thinking back on it, she would still tell herself that she hadn't meant to look. But the screen lit up directly in her line of sight, and the message stayed there long enough for her to read every word. And it wasn't the kind of thing one friend wrote to another. She set the spoon down. The stove kept hissing. The rice pot stayed hot. For one very brief moment, only a few breaths long, she stood there and watched the entire past 18 months rearrange themselves into a completely different shape. And she understood that all those evenings when he came home late, all those weekends when he said he had to meet clients, all those times he turned his phone face down when she entered the room, all of it had had an explanation for a long time. She was simply the only one who had refused to read it. Travis came out of the bedroom, still sliding one arm into his coat. He looked at her, then at his phone, and his expression changed. Not panic, not guilt, only irritation. The kind of irritation a man showed when someone interrupted him in the middle of something. "You looked at my phone?" Adeline didn't answer. She rested one hand against the edge of the stove to keep it from shaking. "Who is she?" "That doesn't matter." He pulled up the zipper of his coat, speaking as casually as if they were discussing taking out the trash. "I was going to tell you this weekend, but if you're going to make a whole thing out of it, we might as well talk now." "I can't keep doing this, Adeline." "Keep doing what?" "This." He swept one hand around the kitchen, taking in her, the room, even the pot still steaming on the stove. "I graduated in my early 20s, worked a few years, then I had you to carry, then your expenses, and now your family too. I can't carry your entire family. I never signed up for that." Adeline heard every word, and what sent a chill down her spine wasn't what he said, but the way he said it. Calm, thought through, rehearsed. "I have never asked you for a single dollar for Jonah, but you think about him every minute of the day. You work 3 shifts. You sleep in your car. You come home at 4 in the morning, and by 7 you're already up and going again. If you live like that, what kind of life am I supposed to have?" He shook his head. "I don't want my life to be this. She wanted to tell him that she didn't want her life to be this either. That no one had asked her what she wanted. That the day someone called about her younger brother, she hadn't been given a choice either. But she said nothing. She asked only one question. The only question that still meant anything to her in that moment. What about the baby? Travis looked at her, and she would remember that look for a very long time. Longer than anything else, he said. That's your problem. He picked up his car keys from the table. The lease is in my name. I'll be home late. Can you have your things out before 10? It wasn't even an order to leave. It was a polite request, the kind people made to a guest who had overstayed. The door closed. The rice was still simmering on the stove, and Adeline stood listening to his footsteps fade down the hallway until there was nothing left. She turned off the burner. She didn't cry. She went into the bedroom, took her wallet, her keys, and the blue-covered notebook she always kept beneath her pillow. And in less time than it would have taken an ordinary person to make a pot of tea, she had walked out of the apartment she had once called home. She didn't take any clothes with her. She didn't even know why she hadn't. Outside, the wind had begun to shift, carrying the damp, salty smell from the bay. The smell everyone in Providence knew meant a very long night was coming. She had a few crumpled bills left in her wallet. She was 9 weeks pregnant, and inside the pocket of her coat, the phone she had forgotten to stop was still recording, quietly capturing every word. Some people, when they lose the place they live in, go looking for somewhere to sleep. Adeline went to work. She drove straight to the Vance Logistics Yard in the industrial district on the south side, where the floodlights always cast a sickly yellow glow, and there was always an oil slick on the pavement that no one ever bothered to clean. On the night shift, people didn't ask each other many questions. You arrived, swiped your card, took your list, loaded the packages into the vehicle, and left. That was exactly why she had chosen nights in the first place. Rita Sandoval sat inside the dispatch booth with her headset crooked over one ear. 3 screens in front of her filled with tiny dots moving slowly across a map of the city. Rita was the only person at the company who called Adeline by her name instead of her driver code. She took one look at Adeline and lowered the headset. You look terrible. I'm fine. No, I mean you look like you've just been through something. Rita leaned closer and lowered her voice. Go home. I'm serious. They just raised the warning level. High winds, local flooding, and the whole east side is pulling back and waiting it out. The people upstairs are already talking about cutting the shift short. Go sleep for one night. I'll make up the hours for you tomorrow. Adeline shook her head and pulled the delivery sheet toward herself. Give me the Blackthorn route. Blackthorn is all hills. In this rain, it turns into a creek. I know that road. Adeline. Rita tapped one finger against the counter. Listen to me. I've sat here for years, and I've watched plenty of people think they can squeeze in one more run. Then they go out and squeeze in one more run. Adeline didn't answer immediately. She opened the blue-covered notebook, placed it on the counter, and turned to the unfinished page. There was no diary inside, no private thoughts, only columns of numbers written in ballpoint pen, dates, clock in and clock out times, package counts, and on the right side, deductions the company called by all kinds of different names. She crossed out one line, added the figures again, then turned the notebook toward Rita. Tomorrow is the payment deadline for Willowbrook. If I'm more than 7 days late, they move me out of the morning program and put me on the waiting list. And once you're on that list, it can take 3 months before a place opens again. Rita looked down at the notebook, then back up at her. She knew about Jonah. She had heard Adeline mention the boy before in the kind of voice people reserved for only one person in the world. How much are you short? 1 night shift. Adeline closed the notebook and slipped it into the inside pocket of her coat. Just 1 shift, Rita. Rita sat still for a moment. Then she pushed the delivery sheet across the counter, though she kept her hand resting on it for 1 more second. Drive slowly. If anything happens, call me. I'm here until morning. Adeline nodded and walked out. When she backed the small delivery truck out of the yard, the rain was still only a light drizzle. By whichever delivery came later, she could no longer remember which one. The rain had grown so heavy that even with the wipers running at full speed, they couldn't keep up. And every time she opened the door, water blew inside and soaked the seat. She delivered packages in the rhythm that had long since become instinct. Get out. Run. Set it down. Take the photograph. Get back in. Cross off another line in her head. Some houses were completely dark. At others, a door opened just wide enough for someone to look out before closing again. At one house in Elmhurst, an old man was already waiting beneath the porch roof, and he handed her a tissue and told her to wipe her face before she caught cold. And Adeline nearly cried over that tissue, something she hadn't done once through everything that had happened earlier that evening. The later it became, the emptier the city grew. By the final stretch of the list, only one address remained. High on Blackthorn Hill, the road climbing the northwestern slope, where the gates stood nearly 100 yards apart, and there wasn't a decent streetlight anywhere. The small truck made it halfway up the hill before it began to lose power. The gauges jumped wildly. A warning light flashed red, and then the engine died completely. She tried to start it again. Nothing. She tried once more. Still nothing. Adeline sat in the dark cab listening to the rain hammer against the roof, and she had exactly one moment to choose. She could call Rita. She could sit there and wait until morning. But an undelivered package didn't count toward her pay, and a missing package meant another deduction, and she had been adding and adding that number in her head all night. So she pulled up her hood, held the package tightly against her chest to keep it dry, opened the truck door, stepped into the rain, and began climbing the rest of the hill on foot. The wind up there was stronger than she had expected. Water ran in streams along the roadside ditch, carrying leaves and dirt with it, and every step she took sank a little into the ground. She lowered her head, held the package tighter, and walked into the darkness between the 2 rows of trees. Then somewhere above her, near the top of the hill, she heard a car. It didn't rush past. It slowed, then came to a complete stop, and the engine kept running steadily there in the darkness. Adeline raised her head and looked, but all she could see was rain. She thought she must have imagined it, that it was only the wind, that her ears were ringing from the cold. Then she lowered her head again and kept walking. The first thing that came back to her was the smell. Not antiseptic, not a hospital, but something dry and warm, like aromatic leaves left to wilt, like the bundles people used to hang in old kitchens. Adeline opened her eyes and looked up at a ceiling so high that it took her a moment to believe it was really there. Molding ran along the edges. A hanging light fixture was dark above her, and the only light in the room came through a narrow gap at the window. Pale gray, the color of morning after a storm. She lay still. She could hear the rain, but it had softened considerably, reduced now to a steady murmur. She moved her toes first, then her fingers, and when she tried to take a deep breath, a sharp pain stabbed through her right side hard enough to bring tears to her eyes. Bandages were wrapped around her chest. An intravenous line was taped to the back of her hand. Someone had changed her clothes and put her in a clean set of soft fabric that didn't belong to her. That was the detail that made her sit upright at once. In Adeline's life, no one had ever done something kind for her, without already thinking about what they would take back in return. She didn't call for help. She didn't call out to anyone. The first thing she did was look for a way out. She pulled the line from her hand, pressed her thumb over the spot until the bleeding stopped, braced both hands against the edge of the bed, and stood. The floor was cold. Her legs felt weak, as though she had been running all night. She made her way along the wall, pausing between each step, reached the door, and turned the handle. It wasn't locked. That frightened her more than a locked door would have. The hallway outside was long and carpeted, lined on both sides with closed doors, with several old framed photographs hanging on the walls that she didn't have time to study. She kept moving, one hand against the wall, counting each door as she passed, and when the hallway opened into a wide foyer with a curved staircase, the edges of her vision began to darken. The darkness moved inward from both sides, slowly, the way curtains close. She had time for one thought, that she couldn't fall, that if she fell, it was over. Then her knees gave way. She never hit the floor. 2 hands caught her by the shoulders, not forcefully, but firmly, and an elderly woman's voice sounded very close beside her, saying something in Italian before switching to English. "Easy, child. Sit here." The old woman helped her onto the lowest stair, keeping one hand behind her back. She wore black, her silver hair pinned neatly into a bun, and around her wrist was a string of wooden beads, worn smooth with age. She didn't ask who Adeline was. She didn't ask where she had come from, why she had been found outside the gates of her house in the middle of a storm, or where she thought she was going after pulling a line from her own hand. She only studied her face for a moment, then asked one question. "When was the last time you ate?" Adeline opened her mouth to answer. Then she realized she couldn't. She remembered the reheated rice on the stove, the pot she had turned off without touching. Before that, she couldn't remember. Maybe a pastry from a gas station, maybe nothing. The old woman looked at her silence and understood all of it. She gave a very small nod, as though Adeline had given her a complete answer. "My name is Graziella. Everyone here calls me Zia Grazia." She turned her head and said something to someone behind them, her voice suddenly sharp, completely different from the one she had just used with Adeline. Then she coughed, a short, dry sound, covered her mouth with one hand, and immediately changed the subject before Adeline could look too closely. "The doctor is downstairs. Can you walk?" Or shall I call someone? The doctor's name was Meredith Kovach. She had salt and pepper hair, cold hands, asked very few questions, and never asked one that wasn't necessary. She examined Adeline all over again right there in the room, pressing carefully along her ribs, telling her to breathe in, telling her to breathe out, making notes, and only then did she explain. 2 ribs were cracked but not completely broken. Her body temperature had dropped dangerously low during the night, but they had managed to bring it back up. There was a cut along her side, not deep, and it had been closed with a few stitches while she was still unconscious. Adeline heard all of it and felt nothing. She was waiting for only one thing. Dr. Kovach looked at her, and perhaps she understood exactly what she was holding in that silence. "The baby is still all right," she said. "The heartbeat is strong. There are no signs of anything concerning." Adeline nodded. Then she covered her mouth with one hand, and for a brief time after that she cried without making a sound, her shoulders trembling, until they finally stopped. Zia Grazia said nothing. She only rested a hand on Adeline's knee. When Adeline was able to lift her head again, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and asked her first question. Not where she was, and not who had brought her there. "How much do I owe? Who is paying for me?" No one answered that question. Dr. Kovach only told her to lie on her left side, left a blister pack of medication on the bedside table, and went away. Zia Grazia took her back to the room, pulled the blanket all the way up to her shoulders the way people did for children, and said nothing about money either. Adeline lay there through the morning, listening to footsteps somewhere downstairs, the sound of a heavy door closing on the ground floor, the murmur of someone speaking in a language she didn't understand. Sometime after noon there was a knock at the door. 2 quiet knocks, unhurried. She said, "Come in." The door opened, and a man stood there. He didn't enter. He stopped exactly at the threshold, one hand still resting on the handle, and Adeline recognized him immediately as the man who had knelt beside her in the rain, even though that night she had seen almost nothing beyond darkness and the blinding light behind him. Now she could see him clearly. He was around 35, tall, with black hair combed back, a jaw that hadn't been shaved closely, and a faint scar cutting across the outer edge of his left eyebrow, something that had been there for a very long time. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. On his left wrist was a watch with scratches across its face, the kind of watch people didn't buy for themselves, the kind they inherited. "You're awake." His voice was low and even, the same voice she remembered from the night before. "Dr. Kovach says you should be able to walk normally again in a few days." Adeline pulled the blanket higher. "You're the one who brought me here." "Yes, thank you." He didn't acknowledge the thanks, but he didn't dismiss it either. He simply stood there, and Adeline noticed that he had no intention of crossing the threshold, even while speaking to someone lying all the way across the room. "You'll stay here until you can move around again," he said. "Food will be taken care of. The doctor will come once a day. There is no charge. There are no conditions." She was silent for a moment. There was something inside her that had learned a long time ago, and learned by paying for the lesson, that words like those never stood alone. "You said there are no conditions." "That's right. Then what do you want from me?" she asked directly, without circling around it, and she looked straight at his face as she did. "I don't have anything to give you. I don't have a home. I don't have steady work. I don't even have one set of my own clothes in this house. So if there is something you plan to take, tell me now, so I know enough to leave." The man at the door didn't become angry. He didn't smile either. He looked at her for a little longer than was comfortable, then spoke, his voice never rising. 3 cars passed the place where you were lying last night. I know because I checked afterward." He paused. "I didn't want there to be a 4th. Adeline opened her mouth as though she might say something, then said nothing at all. She had prepared herself for an offer, for a price, for the kind of sentence people used when they wanted her to understand that she owed them something. She hadn't prepared for that answer. There was nowhere in it for her to take hold and argue. "My name is Renzo Marchetti," he said. "If you need anything, tell Grazia." Then he closed the door, still from the outside, and his footsteps receded across the carpet until she could no longer hear them. Adeline lay still for a very long time. Then she reached for the phone on the bedside table. Someone had plugged it in to charge. The screen lit up with nearly 20 missed calls, most of them from Rita, with several messages in between from a number she had saved under a name she didn't want to open. She didn't open them. She tapped Rita's name and typed exactly one line, saying she was fine. The truck had broken down. She was staying with someone she knew, and she would call tomorrow. She read it once. She knew perfectly well Rita wouldn't believe it. She sent the message, turned the phone off, placed it face down on the table, and lay listening to the rain tapping against the window of a room she couldn't begin to understand why she had been allowed to occupy. By the 4th day, Adeline could walk again, slowly, and with something to hold on to, but she could walk. Dr. Kovac prescribed another medication and said it had to be picked up from a particular pharmacy because the others didn't keep it in stock for pregnant women. And Zia Grazia was busy in the kitchen, so Renzo ended up being the one to go. He said only one thing in the hallway, that if Adeline came along, the doctor could check her again while they were out. And Adeline agreed, because she wanted to get out of that house for a little while too. The car went down the hill, crossed the bridge, then turned into a neighborhood she had only ever passed through without stopping. The houses were low, with red tile roofs. Strings of small flags hung across the street, and rows of plastic chairs sat outside the cafes where old men had been sitting since morning. Renzo parked and got out. Adeline followed several steps behind him, and that was when she began to notice what was happening. The first man was sitting in a chair with a newspaper open across his knees. When he saw Renzo, he stood. He didn't greet him, didn't smile, simply stood and folded the newspaper. A second man sweeping the sidewalk outside a shoe repair shop stopped moving the broom and stepped back inside. At a cafe, 3 men sitting around the same table rose almost at once, and one of them gave the smallest nod. No one said anything. The entire street continued like that, one storefront after another, people standing when Renzo passed and sitting again after he was gone. And Adeline walked behind him with a sudden chill along her spine, because she had seen people rise out of respect before, and this wasn't that. They entered a bakery on the corner. It was warm inside, heavy with the smell of baked flour and caramelized sugar, and the glass display cases were full of pastries. The owner looked to be in his 60s, wearing a white apron dusted with flour, and the moment he saw Renzo, he hurried out from behind the counter, wiping both hands against the apron. He spoke several quick sentences in Italian, sounding relieved and nervous at the same time, then reached beneath the counter, pulled out a thick envelope, and pressed it into Renzo's hands with both of his, the way someone might present an offering. Renzo didn't take it. He looked down at the envelope in the older man's hands, then gently closed the man's fingers around it and pushed it back toward him. "Keep it. But this month, my grandfather took your money because back then you needed someone to stand behind you." Renzo's voice remained even, no louder than the mixer running in the kitchen. "I don't take it because I don't want you to need that anymore. But if anyone comes here asking for this exact envelope, then you know who to call." The older man stood motionless. His mouth moved, but no words came out, and Adeline saw his hands trembling as he tucked the envelope back beneath his apron. Then he turned away very quickly, picked up a tray, rearranged some pastries, did something with the oven, anything at all so he wouldn't have to remain standing there. Renzo pulled out a chair at a table in the corner and told Adeline to sit while they waited. She had been sitting only a few minutes when the bell over the door rang. The man who entered was around 50, wearing a good coat that had become wrinkled, car keys clutched in one hand, and he walked straight to their table as though he had already known he would find Renzo there. He didn't sit. He stood beside the table and began speaking very quickly, saying the project had been delayed, materials had gone up in price. He only needed 2 more months, and he swore on his honor that it was only 2 months. Renzo let him finish. He didn't interrupt once. When the man finally stopped to breathe, Renzo spoke, using exactly the same voice he had used when he told the bakery owner to put the envelope away. "Your project isn't delayed. You completed the final floor before Thanksgiving. The money reached your company account that Friday afternoon." The man straightened. "You have a warehouse lease on the east side of the city under your wife's name. That warehouse is empty. You have been paying monthly rent on an empty warehouse since last summer." Renzo turned the cup slightly on the table. "Your brother has a car wash in Cranston. He just bought the adjoining parcel. He doesn't have the money to buy that land." There was no threat, not a single word of one, but the blood drained from the man's face so quickly that Adeline could see it happen. "Bring me what I need before the end of the week," Renzo said. "Then go explain it to your wife. I can't help you with that part." The man opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He gave one nod, turned around, and walked out of the bakery, the bell above the door jingling behind him. Renzo finished his coffee, stood, and went to collect the bag of medication from the counter, while Adeline remained alone in the warm smell of baked flour, looking out at the street where people were still selling bread, sweeping sidewalks, and reading newspapers as though nothing at all had happened. That evening was the first time Zia Grazia told her to come downstairs and eat with them, instead of having someone carry a tray up to her room. The dining room was in the west wing, with a ceiling lower than Adeline had expected, a real fire burning in the hearth, and a long wooden table large enough for a whole family. Only 3 places had been set, but Adeline counted 4 sets of dishes. The 4th was at the head of the table, closest to the fireplace. A white plate, knife and fork aligned neatly, a water glass filled halfway, a napkin folded in two. Everything was exactly the same as at the other 3 places, except for one thing. That chair had been pushed closer to the table, and when Adeline looked carefully, she could see the faint, dull sheen along the rim of the plate, the look of china that had been wiped clean over and over for years without anyone ever eating from it. She didn't ask. She sat where Grazia told her to sit, and through dinner, she tried not to look toward the head of the table, but her eyes kept drifting there. Renzo sat across from her, ate little, and spoke even less. Grazia talked the entire time, asking whether Adeline could eat fish, asking whether she had woken during the night, asking whether she liked the pastries from the bakery on the corner, and then answering her own question by saying everyone liked them. Halfway through the meal, she caught Adeline staring at the empty place for a little too long. She set down her spoon. "Go ahead and look." Adeline became flustered. "I'm sorry. There is nothing to apologize for." Grazia reached over and straightened the napkin at that place. A gesture so familiar she must have done it thousands of times. That was Serafina's place, his mother. Renzo didn't look up. He kept cutting the food on his plate, but Adeline saw his hand slow. "She married my brother and came here without knowing a word of English. She worked sewing in a factory down the street. Then she came home, cooked for everyone, and ate whatever was left." Grazia spoke in the calm voice of someone who had told the story so many times that it no longer made her tremble. When Renzo was 12, one winter, she started feeling wrong, pain in her chest. I told her to call an ambulance. She wouldn't. She said she would see how she felt in the morning. Adeline sat very still. The next morning she said the same thing. Then noon. Then evening. Grazia folded her own napkin and placed it on the table. I asked her what she was afraid of. She said she wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of the bill. She said if we called an ambulance, it would cost the family several months of wages, and the boy was still growing and needed food. There was a soft touch of metal against china. Renzo set down his knife and fork very gently, without making any real sound. He pushed back his chair, stood, and left the dining room without saying a word to anyone. He didn't look at anyone either. The door closed behind him, and the only sound left in the room was the crackle of wood in the fire. Grazia didn't turn to watch him go. She had known that would happen, just as she had known she would tell the story anyway. "He sat with his mother through that last night," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Ever since then, I have set this place. Every meal. I don't explain it to anyone, and no one asks me." Then she turned toward Adeline, and for the first time that evening, her voice became firm. "Listen to me, child. Poor people don't die from illness. Poor people die from being afraid of the bill. Doctors can treat the illness, but that fear, no one knows how to cure." She stood, gathered her own plate and Renzo's, and before leaving the room, she rested one hand briefly on Adeline's shoulder, then walked away. Adeline remained alone at the long table with her unfinished meal in front of her, while at the head of the table sat a place with a plate, utensils, and a glass of water waiting for someone who would never come. She looked at it for a very long time. Her own mother had died on a March afternoon at home, in the armchair beside the window, after months of saying she was only tired and that seeing a doctor would cost too much. Adeline had already been working then, and she could still remember sitting in the company parking lot, pressing the buttons on a pocket calculator again and again, adding her wages to everything they might possibly sell, trying to see whether it would be enough. She had never told anyone that story. She didn't tell it that evening either. She only sat in silence inside the warm room, listening to the fire, and for the first time since that night in the rain, she understood that the man who had stopped his car for her was not entirely a stranger. After dinner that evening, Adeline began looking for something to do. Lying around made her feel indebted, and being indebted was something she couldn't bear. Zia Grazia understood that faster than Adeline expected, so she gave her a stack of paperwork from the fund the family still used to help pay funeral expenses and school tuition for people in the neighborhood, telling her to put it in order because her eyes weren't what they used to be, and she had never been good with machines. Adeline worked on it in the small room beside the library, where there was an old computer and an external hard drive already plugged in. The work was dull, but she did it carefully, sorting everything by year, by surname, by type of expense. By the afternoon of the second day, she opened the wrong folder. It had no name, only a string of characters, buried among several folders of old photographs. And when she clicked on it, what appeared inside wasn't paperwork, but a long list of video files named by date. Security camera footage. She meant to close it immediately. Her finger had already moved, but her eyes had caught one date, and that date was the night of the storm. She sat completely still for a long time. Outside, it was already dark, and somewhere in the house she heard someone pass through the hallway, and then move away. Then she lifted the mouse and clicked. The first angle was from the gatepost, looking outward, the lens half blurred by rain. She saw the slope, the distant glow of a streetlight far below, and she saw herself, a small shadow clutching a package against her chest, head lowered as she climbed through the water. She skipped ahead. She didn't need to watch that part again. She switched to the second file, from a camera mounted higher up, and aimed toward the top of the hill, and this was the part that made her sit straighter in the chair. In the frame, a black sport utility vehicle came out through the gate, turned downhill, and drove toward the small figure walking through the rain. At the bend, the rear tire crossed a stream of water spilling over the road and threw up a sheet of spray. The small figure in the image staggered sideways. The vehicle didn't stop. It continued toward the top of the hill and disappeared from the frame. Adeline paused the video. She sat there with her hand still resting on the mouse, and the first thing she felt wasn't anger but a strange emptiness. The feeling of someone who has just discovered that a story she has been telling herself for days wasn't true in the way she had believed. She dragged the timeline backward and watched it again, slowly. Then she opened the third file. This camera was positioned at the highest corner and showed the entire stretch near the top of the hill. The sport utility vehicle entered the frame. It slowed. Then it stopped. It didn't pull to the side. It didn't shut off the engine. It stopped in the middle of the road, its red rear lights reflecting across the wet pavement. 2 streaks of red blurred through the rain, and it remained there. Adeline watched the seconds counting in the corner of the screen. She watched 10 seconds pass, then 20. She leaned closer to the monitor, and there was no real thought in her mind then. Only those 2 red rear lights standing still in the rain, and the numbers continuing to move. 30 seconds. No one got out. No door opened. The vehicle simply stayed there with its engine running in the middle of a road where not another person could be seen. While farther down the hill, outside the frame, someone was lying on the pavement. At 40 seconds, the reverse lights came on. The vehicle turned around. It drove back down the hill, and this time it moved faster than it had on the way up. Adeline replayed that part. She watched it a second time, then a third, and every time she stopped at the exact moment when those 2 red lights stood motionless in the rain. She stared at them until her vision blurred from looking too long at the same point. 40 seconds. She counted them again in her head, slowly. 1, 2, 3. Trying to measure how long 40 seconds really was. And she realized it was much longer than she had imagined. Long enough to make a short phone call. Long enough for a man sitting inside a warm, dry vehicle to consider something. She didn't know what that something had been. She sat before the darkened screen in a room lit only by the light spilling in from the hallway. And one question kept repeating in her mind. A question she had no way to answer. What had the man who later knelt beside her in the rain been thinking about during those 40 seconds? She found him in the study at the end of the ground floor hallway, the desk lamp still on, papers spread open in front of him. Adeline knocked and walked in without waiting to be invited. She placed the external hard drive on his desk. The car that night was yours. Renzo looked at the hard drive, then at her. He didn't ask where she had found it, didn't ask what she had watched, and there wasn't even a second when the color of his face changed. Yes, one word. No defense, no explanation attached to it, and that was what made Adeline feel as though the floor had shifted beneath her. She had prepared herself for a denial, or a long explanation, or something like "my driver didn't see you." She hadn't prepared for him to admit it immediately. "You stopped at the top of the hill." She heard her voice break in the middle of the sentence and hated it. 40 seconds. I counted it over and over 4 times. You sat in that car for exactly 40 seconds before you turned around, while I was lying down there. Renzo stood. He didn't move toward her. "Tell me, what were you doing for those 40 seconds? He was silent. The desk lamp cast light across one side of his face, and Adeline saw something there she had never seen before. Not even that afternoon in the bakery, when he had drained the color from a grown man's face with nothing but the sound of his voice. He didn't look away. He looked directly at her. "You don't want to know. You don't get to decide for me what I want to know." "No," he said it quietly, "but I'm still not going to tell you." Adeline remained there for another few seconds. Then she picked up the hard drive, placed it back exactly where it had been on his desk, and walked out. She went upstairs and packed, and it took less than 10 minutes because she had almost nothing. The clothes she had been wearing the night of the accident were ruined and had been thrown away. She folded the clothes Grazia had given her and left them neatly on the bed, along with the cloth shoes, and put on the same delivery coat with the torn side that someone had washed and hung in the closet. She took her wallet, her phone, and the blue-covered notebook. She took nothing else that belonged to the house. Zia Grazia was standing at the top of the staircase when she came down. She wore a night robe, the wooden beads still around her wrist, and she had known already. Adeline could see from her face that she had known. Grazia didn't ask why. She didn't try to stop her. She only followed Adeline all the way to the front door, and when Adeline opened it, Grazia said a single sentence in her own language that Adeline didn't understand, then stood there with her arms folded across her chest and watched her walk down the steps. Adeline didn't look back. She walked through the gate and down the hill, the same hill she hadn't managed to finish the last time. And this time there was no rain, only cold wind and dry pavement. She made it all the way down, reached the main road, and called for a ride. The motel she found was beside the highway on the south side, the kind with parking directly outside each room, and a neon sign with one burned-out letter blinking above the lot. She paid for 2 nights. She sat on the edge of the bed in that room without turning on the television or the main light, one hand resting over her stomach, listening to trucks pass outside in waves, and she allowed herself to be afraid for exactly a little while, then stopped. Near midnight there was a knock at the door. She opened it only a few inches, and saw Renzo standing beneath the awning, outside the reach of the light, both hands in the pockets of his coat. He didn't step inside. He didn't ask whether she intended to come back. "How long have you worked for Vance?" Adeline didn't answer. He took a business card from his coat pocket and held it out to her. There was a name on it, and beneath the name were the words, "Labor Attorney. Call this person. You should know what rights you have." When he finished, he gave one small nod, turned, and walked back toward the car. Adeline stood in the narrow opening of the door and watched until his taillights disappeared around the bend in the highway. Then she closed the door, sat down on the edge of the bed, and turned the business card over and over in her hands for a very long time. The first thing Adeline did the next morning was not call the lawyer. She called Willowbrook. She sat on the edge of the bed in that motel room, the business card lying face down on the nightstand, and dialed a number she had known by heart for so long that her fingers moved without her mind having to think. She had already prepared what she was going to say. She would ask for an extension. She would explain that she was in the middle of changing jobs, that she needed a few more days, that please, they couldn't move her brother down to the waiting group because 3 months was a very long time for that boy. She had rehearsed those words in her head all night. A young woman in administration answered. Adeline gave her brother's name, read out the file number, then began the speech she had practiced. She had barely gotten through 2 sentences when the woman on the other end interrupted her. "Could you hold for just a moment, please? I think there may be some kind of mistake." There was the sound of typing. Someone in the background called out a question, then went quiet. Adeline sat still, gripping the phone tightly. "Miss Rourke, your brother's file isn't on any overdue list." "No, I think you must have looked up the wrong one. My payment deadline is. I have the correct file." The young woman's voice softened, the way a person's voice does when she suddenly realizes she is holding information the other person doesn't know yet. "Your brother is no longer on a monthly payment plan. His file was moved to full coverage some time ago. The entire rehabilitation program, both morning and afternoon sessions, the intensive physical therapy, plus the assistive equipment, has all been paid in full. You don't owe anything else." Adeline couldn't speak. She could hear herself breathing into the phone. When was it changed? More typing. The young woman read out the date. Adeline counted it backward in her head, and she had to do it twice before she believed it. It was less than 2 weeks after the night of the storm. 2 weeks after the night she had lain outside someone else's gate, like a package that had been dropped. At that point she still couldn't walk properly. At that point she didn't yet know how many rooms were in that house. Didn't know the name of the old woman who set a place at the table for someone who had died. Had never been anyone at all to the man who lived there. Who paid for it? "I'm not allowed to give you that information. The party who made the payment requested confidentiality." The young woman hesitated. "But please don't worry. The payment went through completely. Every dollar is there." Adeline thanked her and ended the call. She sat there in the roadside motel room with traffic passing outside in waves, staring at the wall in front of her without seeing anything. She thought about the afternoon she had opened the blue-covered notebook in front of Rita and asked for the blackthorn root. She thought about how she had carried that package up the hill on foot, because every time she added the numbers again, she was still exactly 1 shift short. She thought about how for weeks now, every night before sleeping, she had calculated how many deliveries she would need to make the following month, while the burden she believed she was carrying had in fact stopped existing long ago. And that man had sat across the table from her, had driven her into the neighborhood to pick up medication, had stood at the threshold of her room without stepping inside, and not once, not with a single word, had he let her know. Adeline stood. She slipped the blue-covered notebook into the inside pocket of her coat, took her wallet, returned the room key at the front desk, then went outside to wait for a ride beside the road. The sky had cleared that day, the sunlight weak, the wind still cold. During the entire drive back to Blackthorn Hill, she couldn't think of what she would say when she saw him. She didn't need to. When the car stopped outside the gate was already open, and Zia Grazia was standing on the porch, holding a pair of pruning shears, as though she came out there every morning and waited. She looked at Adeline, gave one nod, then turned toward the house and called something in Italian. Adeline climbed the steps and returned to the room with the high ceiling and the smell of herbs, and she thought that was the end of one story. But somewhere in the city, an unusually large expense, paid in full with no name attached to the person who had paid it, had settled onto a page in Willowbrook's records and remained there quietly for months, waiting for someone who knew how to read paperwork to find it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning by registered mail, forwarded from the old apartment address on Waterman Street. The company name was embossed on the envelope, with a small line beneath it stating that the recipient's signature was required. Adeline opened it right there on the porch. Inside were 3 sheets of paper, neatly typed, without a single correction anywhere. The first notified her that the transportation partnership was being terminated, effective as of the date printed at the top of the letter, for reasons stated clearly as loss of merchandise during an assigned shift, and leaving the assigned vehicle without authorization. The second was a copy of the contract she had signed on her very first day of work, the one they had handed her along with the vehicle keys, and told her to sign wherever there was a pencil mark, the contract she had never read all the way through. There, halfway down the second page, one clause had been underlined in yellow marker. It stated that the transportation contractor assumed full responsibility for both merchandise and vehicle for the entire duration of an assigned shift. The third page was an itemized statement: the value of the missing package, the cost of towing the vehicle off Blackthorn Hill, the cost of the engine repair, the deduction for the unfinished shift. Added together, they came to a number printed in bold on the final line, followed by a courteous offer stating that if she wished to pay in installments, the company would be willing to establish a separate payment agreement. Adeline read all 3 pages twice. Not one word was illegal. There was no threat. No one called her. No one came looking for her. And there wasn't a single sentence she could carry into court and point to. There was only paper, ink, a signature. And the signature at the bottom of the page was one she had seen 1,000 times on her pay statements. Slow, rounded handwriting belonging to a man who wrote his name with a fountain pen instead of a ballpoint. Gerald Vance. She went inside and called Rita. Rita listened, then stayed silent for a long time on the other end. Finally, she said, her voice gone dry, that a few days earlier he had come down to the dispatch booth, something that had never happened once since the day Rita started working there, and he had asked exactly one question: who had taken the Blackthorn route that night, and who had approved that driver to go out. Rita said she had told him that she was the one who approved it. Adeline asked what happened after that. Rita said nothing happened. He only nodded, thanked her, and went back upstairs. That was what had sent the chill through her. That afternoon, Adeline called Willowbrook again. She intended only to reassure herself that Jonah's program was still secure. But this time, the person who answered wasn't the young administrative worker from before. It was someone else, with a noticeably more guarded voice. And that person said the finance department was reviewing several accounts, because the center had recently received a formal request from a law office. Adeline asked what the letter said. The person explained that it questioned the source of a full payment that had been submitted anonymously, cited financial transparency requirements for nonprofit facilities, and requested that the center provide information identifying the party who had made the payment. Adeline asked who had sent the letter. The person read out the name of the law office. She didn't recognize it, but on the last line, where the represented client was listed, she did. She ended the call and sat in the hallway for a very long time. It was much simpler than she had imagined. The night she had carried that package up the hill on foot, the company vehicle had died in the middle of the road and had to be towed away. And somewhere in the records of Vance Logistics, there was a towing expense tied to an address on Blackthorn Hill. All it took was one person who knew how to read paperwork and compare records to discover where she had been left that night and who had picked her up. Then that person only had to keep looking for whatever else in her life was worth holding on to. And that thing was sitting right there on the records of a rehabilitation center in the suburbs, in the form of a large payment with no payer's name attached. Adeline looked down at the 3 sheets of paper resting across her knees. She had been afraid of many things in her life. She had been afraid of knocking at the door near midnight, afraid of the brown envelope from the hospital, afraid of calls from unfamiliar numbers during business hours. But she had never imagined there would come a day when she would sit trembling because of a beautifully typed stack of papers prepared by a man who had never once raised his voice to her, signed with a fountain pen. She carried the 3 sheets into his study and laid them on the desk, then told him about the letter that had been sent to Willowbrook as well. Renzo read from the first page to the last without skipping a single line, including the clause marked in yellow. He read slowly. When he finished, he folded the 3 sheets back along their original creases, placed them on the desk, and sat still for exactly 1 beat. Then he reached for the phone. "What are you doing?" "He has vehicles. Vehicles need somewhere to park, somewhere to be serviced, somewhere to change tires." Renzo opened his contacts. "He has freight. Freight needs warehouses, transfer yards, places at the port where containers can be unloaded. He has insurance on his fleet, and that insurance is handled by someone I know." He said all of it in the same voice someone might use to read a grocery list. 3 days. By the end of this week, there won't be anyone left in this state willing to sign a contract with him. Adeline watched his finger stop over a name in the contacts and realized that it was really about to happen, right now, in this room, with nothing more than 1 press of his thumb. She stepped forward and placed her hand on the desk between him and the phone. "Wait." Renzo looked up. "Hear me out first." She drew in a breath, and her voice came out calmer than she expected. "I'm not talking about right and wrong. I'm talking about money. If you do this, then within 3 days that company loses every partner it has, right? Then what happens? It has no work to run, no money coming in, the banks close in, and it files for bankruptcy. How long? 1 month? 2? Faster. Then that ruins everything." Renzo said nothing. "Do you know what is in my notebook?" She took the blue-covered notebook from inside her coat and placed it beside the 3 sheets. "It isn't only me. There are almost 20 names in there. People who had money deducted exactly the way I did. One man was charged for fuel in the company's own vehicle. Someone else was penalized for late deliveries on a storm day when the company itself forced them to stay on the road. One woman was charged for her uniform 3 times in 1 year." She tapped a finger against the cover. "Those amounts are their money. Not charity, not money from you. They're wages, taken from them through paperwork. And if the company goes bankrupt before this reaches court, they don't get a cent of it back." She slowed down. "You aren't in this business, so you don't know. In bankruptcy, the assets get divided, and the banks come first, taxes come first, secured creditors come first. Workers stand at the end of the line. By the time anyone reaches them, there is nothing left. He closes this company, then 6 months later opens another one under a different name, hires the same people back, and gives them the exact same contract to sign." She paused, "And all those claims disappear with the company that died. You wouldn't destroy him. You would only help him wipe the books clean." The only sound in the room was a clock somewhere in the hallway. Renzo looked at her. He looked for a very long time, long enough that Adeline had to work not to look away. And in that silence, she understood something she wouldn't know how to put into words until much later, that this man had never once had anyone speak to him in that tone, not someone who spoke and was ignored. No one at all. In this house, people spoke to him by nodding. Out there, across 7 blocks, people spoke to him by standing up. "You want me to leave him alone. I want you to leave him alive long enough to pay." Renzo lowered his eyes to the phone in his hand. Then he turned off the screen and placed it face down on the desk. He didn't do it quickly, didn't slam it down, simply set it there. But Adeline saw something heavy in that motion, the way a person lowers an object he has been accustomed to carrying his entire life. "Then how do we do it?" he asked. "I don't know yet." She picked up the notebook. "But I have dozens of names, and I have dates for every deduction. That is something he can't just feed into a shredder." Renzo gave one nod. He made no promises and didn't praise her. He only pushed the 3 sheets back toward her and told her to keep them safe, not to lose them. Then reached over and switched on the desk lamp because it had grown dark outside, and Adeline walked out of the room with the strange feeling that something very large had just happened without anyone raising their voice. The lawyer, whose name was on the business card, told her to do something very boring, which was to look up every legal entity connected to Gerald Vance through the state's business registration portal, print all of them, then compare the registered addresses and the names of the listed representatives. Adeline spent 2 full days doing that in the small room beside the library. Most of the names meant nothing. An equipment rental company, a parking management company, a cold storage maintenance company that had already gone out of business. She wrote every one into the blue-covered notebook, the company name in the left column and the address in the right. By the afternoon of the 2nd day, her hand stopped. There was one name she had seen somewhere before, not in this pile of papers. Somewhere else. A long time ago. On another sheet she had held in her hands during an afternoon she didn't want to remember. She sat still for a while, then went upstairs and brought down the cardboard box she had always kept. The box containing everything related to Jonah, and pulled out the old file. The name was right there in the upper right corner beneath the words construction subcontractor. She placed the two sheets side by side on the table. The same registered address, the same legal representative, the same mailing box on a street below the port. The company that had hired her younger brother and the company now sending her bills demanding compensation were two different shells belonging to the same man. Adeline didn't stand up right away. She continued turning through the old file slowly until she reached the contract Jonah had signed on the day he started work. She had read it before, back then, but back then she had read it the way a terrified person reads. Not the way someone reads when she knows exactly what she is looking for. Now she knew. It wasn't an employment contract. It was an independent contractor agreement. The same form, the same clause, except that under type of work it said construction instead of transportation. She turned to the attached personnel list the insurance company had sent back at the time. Every one of them. Not a single exception. That entire work site, from the men mixing mortar to the men operating machinery, had no employees at all. Every person there was classified as an independent contractor. Everyone responsible for himself under the exact wording printed on the second page. That was why, when everything happened, the insurance company had sent only one letter, and that letter hadn't even filled half a page. Adeline closed the file. She sat there for a very long time, and there was no sound in her mind at all, only the image of herself standing in Renzo's study a few days earlier, her hand on the desk blocking the space between him and the phone, her voice perfectly calm as she told him to leave Gerald Vance alive long enough to pay. She had stopped him herself, with reason, with numbers. The next morning she took a ride to Willowbrook. Jonah was in the therapy room at the end of the hallway, and he heard his sister outside the door, turned his head, and broke into a wide grin. "You're early. Come in. I want to show you something." He told her to step back a little so he would have room, then gripped the two parallel bars, took a breath, and lifted both hands away from them for long enough that she could count several beats. "See that? Last week I could only do one. Are you practicing more at night? Deb is here. She opens the therapy room for me after dinner and says she is cleaning, not opening it for me, so no one can complain." He laughed. "And apparently she cleans by sitting in a chair and timing me." Then he kept talking about therapy, about the old man in the room next door who was convinced Jonah was his grandson and saved part of his pastry for him every day, about how he was thinking of starting school again remotely, about how an old friend had texted to ask if he wanted to go to a game next season and Jonah had already answered yes. He talked the entire time, excited, his hands moving as he spoke, and not once did he ask where his sister was living now, how money was going, whether she was all right. He believed everything was still the same. He had always believed that. Before she left, he took her hand and told her that by next month he might be able to take a few steps without holding on, so she had better not start crying before he even did it. Adeline laughed and told him to worry about learning to walk, then left the room. She walked the length of the hallway. She said goodbye to the receptionist. She went out to the parking lot, opened the car door, sat behind the wheel, and closed the door. Then she remained there. She didn't put the key into the ignition. Outside, someone pushed a cart past. Birds called from the row of trees. Sunlight came through the windshield at an angle and warmed the entire dashboard. Adeline sat in the car for a very long time, with both hands resting on the steering wheel. And she stayed that way until the sun disappeared behind the buildings on the other side of the parking lot. Rita's dispatch booth was on the second floor, and in all the years she had worked there, she had never once been called up to the third. So when the secretary came down and said Mr. Vance wanted to see her upstairs, Rita already knew this wasn't something small. His office was neat to the point of discomfort. On the desk there was only a lamp, a file, and a fountain pen placed perfectly parallel to the edge of the papers. He told her to sit, asked how her husband had been lately, asked what grade her oldest child was in this year, and he asked in the voice of a man who had genuinely remembered those details. Then he opened the file. Inside were printed system access logs. Several lines had been highlighted in yellow. He turned the file toward her so she could see them clearly. "Do you know what a dispatch account is authorized to look up, and what it isn't authorized to look up?" Rita didn't answer. "You access deduction statements for other drivers. More than once. Several of those drivers weren't even assigned to routes under your supervision." He tapped one finger lightly against the page. "This is called accessing internal data outside the scope of your duties. You signed a confidentiality agreement on your first day. I have the original right here. Rita sat still. She thought about the night she had looked things up for Adeline, and she remembered thinking that a few lines couldn't possibly matter. I can send this to legal, Vance said. They'll file suit. You'll need to hire an attorney. I can't tell you how long that will take, or how much it will cost, but I can tell you something more certain. The transportation industry in this state is very small. People pass names around. A dispatcher removed from a company for a confidentiality violation won't get hired by a second company. Not because they dislike you, because their insurance won't allow it. He picked up the fountain pen, turned it slowly in his hand, then placed it back exactly where it had been. Or I can close this file right now, and you can tell me where Miss Rourke is staying. Rita sat in that room across from a man who hadn't raised his voice to her once. She thought about her husband. She thought about her 2 children. She thought about what she would have to say at home the next morning. Then she thought about that stormy night, about Adeline's voice saying just 1 shift, Rita, only 1, and about how she herself had been the one to push the route sheet across the counter. I don't know where she is, Rita said. Vance looked at her. Think about it. You have until this afternoon. I don't need to think about it. She stood. Send it to legal. She went back down to the 2nd floor, packed the things from her drawer into a cardboard box she had to ask the warehouse for, and did it very slowly because her hands were shaking. No one in the booth said anything. Only one young dispatcher stood and opened the door for her. When she reached the middle of the yard, she stopped for a moment, with the cardboard box balanced against her hip, and looked at the company sign mounted on the wall, then continued toward the parking lot. She sat in her car and called Adeline. Adeline answered immediately. Rita didn't apologize. She didn't begin by telling her that she had just lost her job either. She went straight to the point. Listen to me. He's looking for you. Not because he wants to talk. He's looking because he wants to know where you are. And he knows you aren't at your old place anymore. She breathed out. He has the system access logs. He pulled up every time I looked something up for you. That means he has been sitting there going through it line by line. Do you understand? He isn't doing this carelessly. He is preparing. Adeline asked if she was all right. Rita was silent for 1 beat. I quit. Rita, don't. Her voice hardened. Listen carefully. I didn't tell him anything, so he'll have to find another way. And another way means he'll look for someone closer to you than I am. Just remember that for me. Then she said she had to go home and make dinner, and she ended the call before Adeline could say anything else. 3 days later, the 2nd letter arrived. It was no longer sent to the old address on Waterman Street. It came directly to Blackthorn Hill, with the correct house number and her name written correctly, sitting among the morning mail that was always left on the table in the front hall. Adeline picked it up, and her hand went cold. Renzo looked at the envelope once, then set it down. He asked nothing. He stepped into the hallway, called out a name, and by noon there were more people coming and going through the house than usual. Men Adeline had only ever seen in passing, and had never been introduced to. By late afternoon, everything had gathered in the large room beside the library, and Zia Grazia told Adeline to go upstairs and rest, but she said it while looking toward the door. Adeline didn't go upstairs. She stayed seated on the bottom step, the same place where the old woman had caught her and helped her sit down weeks earlier, and from there she could see into the large room through the open doorway. Inside, 7 or 8 men stood along the walls. In the middle, seated in a chair pulled away from the others, was a broad man in his 50s, with closely cut hair that had gone almost completely gray, both hands resting on his thighs. Adeline had seen him many times before. He was often outside by the cars smoking, and he always gave her a small nod whenever she passed. Bruno Calderaro. Renzo stood across from him with both hands in his pockets. On the table between them lay a single sheet of paper. Everyone out, Renzo said. The men left the room, passing directly in front of Adeline without any of them looking at her. The door closed, but not completely, leaving a narrow gap. Inside, Renzo didn't pace. He simply stood there, and when he spoke, his voice dropped lower even than it had that afternoon in the bakery, so low that Adeline had to hold her breath to hear him, and because she had to hold her breath to hear him, a chill ran straight down her spine. How many years have you been with me, Bruno? Since your grandfather was alive. You carried me at my mother's funeral. Yes. Then explain this to me. Bruno didn't deny it. He sat in silence for a while, then began to speak, and his voice broke on the very first sentence. He told Renzo about his daughter. He said the illness had a long name he could never remember. All he remembered was that every time they came home from an appointment there was another stack of papers. He said the insurance covered one part and refused another, and for months he had been borrowing from one place to pay another, and last month someone called to say that if the balance wasn't paid, she would have to be transferred. Then someone came to him. That person didn't threaten him once. He only placed a paper in front of him that had already been signed, stating that the entire balance would be erased, and told Bruno that all he had to do was give them one address. "You have a fund," Renzo said. "You built that fund with your own hands. You spent an entire winter sitting with my grandfather to create it. You wrote those rules out by hand." "I know. Then why didn't you say something?" There was a long silence. Then Bruno answered, even more quietly than Renzo. "I built it for other people. I couldn't hold out my hand and ask for something I helped create." Renzo said nothing. He stood there, and Adeline watched through the narrow opening in the door. And in that moment she believed absolutely anything could happen next. Not because he did anything, because he did nothing at all, because he simply stood there. And that stillness carried more weight than anything she had ever seen in this man. Then he picked up the paper from the table, folded it, and slipped it into his coat pocket. "Do you know what hurts the most?" he said. "It isn't that you sold me. I can live with that. I chose this kind of life." He paused. "What hurts is that after all these years, you still thought I would let your daughter lie there. You would rather sell me to some man off the street than ask me one question. What do you think I am, Bruno?" The large man sitting in the chair lowered his head and covered his face with both hands. Renzo turned away. He opened the door, and light from the hallway spilled into the room, and he stopped at the threshold for exactly 1 second before speaking without turning around. "Go home. Tomorrow, go to the hospital with your daughter." The next morning, someone from the Marchetti household was standing at the hospital cashier's desk when it opened. The entire outstanding balance was paid at once, with no installments, and an additional amount was placed in advance toward the next stage of treatment. No one had been told to keep it secret, and no one said anything about it either. Bruno didn't appear at Blackthorn Hill for several days afterward. Bruno came back late one afternoon that weekend. He didn't use the front door. He waited in the back courtyard until Renzo came out, then handed him a thick paper bag with both hands, exactly the way the bakery owner had once offered him the envelope. He didn't apologize. He only said that the company still used an outside fleet to move refrigerated freight along the northern route, that he had known the dispatcher for that fleet since the days when both of them worked at the port, and that outsourced runs always required bills of lading kept by both sides. Then, he went home and didn't stay for dinner, even when Zia Grazia called after him. That night, Adeline didn't sleep. She spread everything across the long table in the library beneath the only lamp still burning in the house. On the left was the stack of internal bills of lading, thin paper printed by impact machine, the duplicate sheets already yellow with age. On the right was her blue-covered notebook. She began with the first page. Date, time the shift began, time the vehicle was returned, number of packages. Then the column on the right, the one that had made her throat tighten every time she wrote in it, the deductions and the names the company gave them. She found that date in the stack of shipping records. She traced the route code, and there, on the paper-thin record of an outside transportation company that had nothing to do with her, were the times the freight left the warehouse and arrived at its destination. She placed the two figures side by side. According to the bill of lading, the freight had left the warehouse nearly an hour and a half later than the time listed on the dispatch order, which meant her route had started late that day through no fault of her own. But on her pay statement, she was the one charged for the late delivery. Adeline sat straighter. Then she did it again with another date. Then another. She worked through the entire night, and the more she worked, the more her hands trembled, but not from exhaustion. It matched. Not once, not twice. It matched into a pattern. On days when the warehouse released freight late, the drivers were charged for delays. On storm days, dispatch orders still went out, and anyone who refused was marked as having failed to complete a shift, and a failed shift meant another deduction. Fuel for company vehicles was recorded as a contractor fuel charge. Uniform costs were deducted several times a year from the same person. And at the bottom of every statement there was always the same clause. The clause stating that independent contractors assumed responsibility for themselves. Printed in small type, signed by everyone, read by no one. She turned to the last pages of the notebook, where she had copied the names of other people from her shifts whenever she happened to hear them. Names she had written down only because at the time, their stories had sounded like hers. Nearly 20 names. She sat staring at that list until dawn began to lighten the windows. Renzo came downstairs early and found her still sitting there. He looked at the two stacks of papers, at the lines she had drawn with a ruler, at the blue-covered notebook lying open in the middle of the table. He didn't ask what she had found. He asked only one question. Is it enough? It's enough. He nodded. Then we do it your way. Adeline stood. She had been thinking about this sentence all night between those columns of numbers, and now she said it with more certainty than she had expected. I have one condition. Say it. From now until this is over, you don't deal with anyone in your way without telling me first." She looked directly at him. "I'm not asking you to get my permission. I don't have any right to give you permission for anything. But you have to tell me first. Because if this case wins through some method I don't know about, then it doesn't belong to the people in this notebook anymore. It belongs to you. And I don't want my child growing up one day hearing that their mother got justice because someone else cleared the road for her." Renzo was silent for a long time. Then he held out his hand. She shook it, and his hand was warm and dry, and he held hers just slightly longer than an ordinary handshake. "Close to noon," the lawyer called. Adeline put the phone on speaker so Renzo could hear too. The person on the other end spoke quickly, in the voice of someone reading from a screen while talking. That morning, Gerald Vance had completed the transfer of the entire operation into a new legal entity, with a different name, a different tax identification number, and the same address. The old entity had been moved into inactive status. At the same time, he had filed a request asking the court to seal all internal records belonging to the old entity on the grounds of protecting trade secrets, and the request had been granted temporarily, with immediate effect, which meant that as of that morning, every original payroll record, every dispatch order, every deduction statement from all those years now sat behind a door no one could open. Adeline looked down at the table, at the blue-covered notebook lying open among the papers, and understood that what she held in her hands was now the only surviving record left in the world. Rita called the following afternoon and said she still had a few things. Back when she was working, whenever she printed a statement for a driver who had a question, she always printed an extra copy and kept it in her drawer, the habit of someone who had been doing the job for a long time, just in case anyone ever came back asking. She said she had put everything into an envelope, and she didn't want to send it through the mail. Rita's apartment building was on the west side, an old building with an exterior staircase and a green-painted iron railing with the paint peeling away. Adeline went alone. She had told Renzo she was going to pick up the papers and would come straight back. And he had looked at her for a while before nodding, because that was her own condition, that she didn't want someone following her around as though she were a piece of property. She reached the third-floor landing and found two men standing there. She recognized them immediately. Both were Vance drivers. One was Duffy, who often ran the refrigerated route, and the other was someone she knew only by sight. They were dressed for work, and the older man was holding his cap in both hands, twisting it over and over. "Miss Rourke," he spoke quickly, almost stumbling over the words. "We don't mean anything by this. We've been waiting here since noon." Adeline stepped back half a pace. "How did you know I would be here?" "We asked Rita. She wouldn't tell us. We just guessed you would come." The other man cut in, his voice shaking. "Please, withdraw the complaint. We're begging you. They've been meeting upstairs all week, and they're saying if this goes to court, the company will have to cut routes. And if they cut routes, they cut people. I have 3 kids. He is still making payments on his car." "We know you're right," the man holding the cap said, and his voice broke. "We know you're right, but being right doesn't feed my children." He stepped forward once, just one step, and he still held the cap in his hands, and he never touched her. But Adeline was standing close to the edge of the landing, and she stepped backward by instinct, and her heel came down where there was nothing beneath it. The hospital room was quiet and brightly lit, smelling nothing like the high-ceilinged room at Blackthorn Hill. Adeline lay on the bed, listening to the soft, steady rhythm of the heart monitor beside her. Outside in the hallway, Rita sat in a plastic chair with both arms wrapped around the envelope she had never gotten the chance to hand to anyone, repeating to herself that she had called the ambulance right away. Dr. Kovac came in and out 3 times during the night. The second time, she sat beside the bed and spoke with them, using very neutral words. She talked about observation, about risk, about how the next several hours would matter, and said it was still too early to say anything with certainty. Then she went back out to check the charts. After midnight, Rita finally fell asleep on the chair outside. That left 2 people inside the quiet room. Renzo sat in the chair beside her bed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, and in his hands was Zia Grazia's string of wooden beads, which he had taken with him when he left the house. He wasn't praying. He was only rolling the beads between 2 fingers. "You asked me what I was doing during those 40 seconds. He spoke without looking up. Adeline turned her head on the pillow toward him. She had thought that part of the story was over. "I sat in the car and calculated," he continued. "I saw someone lying down there. I didn't know who. And my mind started working the way it has worked for decades. If I stopped, I would have to take that person somewhere. If I took them somewhere, I would have to give my name. If I gave my name, there would be a record. If there was a record, then the following week someone would be sitting there reading it, and asking what a Marchetti car was doing on that hill at that hour. He paused. I sat there and calculated what stopping would cost me. Adeline said nothing. Then I remembered something. His voice grew rough. I remembered my mother. She was lying in bed, and she was doing the exact same kind of calculation. She was figuring out how much an ambulance would cost, then dividing it by the number of months, then thinking about me being a growing boy who needed food. She finished the calculation and decided it wasn't worth it. His hand tightened around the wooden beads. I was 12 years old. I sat beside her through her last night and swore to myself that I would never let money make a decision for me again. Then, all those years later, I was sitting in a warm car with someone lying in the rain in front of me, and I did exactly what she had done. He looked up at Adeline for the first time. For those 40 seconds, I wasn't thinking about you. I was thinking about money. That is why I didn't want to tell you. Adeline lay very still for a long time. Then she spoke quietly. But you turned the car around, 40 seconds late. The 3 cars before you didn't turn around. Near dawn, Dr. Kovac came back into the room. She removed her mask, checked the monitor one last time, and looked down at them. She said they had made it through, that the numbers had stabilized several hours earlier, and that both mother and baby were all right. The story of Adeline being hospitalized appeared in the local paper, only a few lines in the city news section, with her name and the name of the pending labor complaint. Less than a week later, Travis Doyle appeared at Blackthorn Hill with a man in a suit carrying a leather briefcase. Zia Grazia was about to close the door, but Renzo told her to let them in. He received them in the sitting room, pulled out chairs for them, and poured wine into 2 small glasses with his own hand, as though he were welcoming an old friend. The man in the suit began speaking in a smooth voice, saying that his client was the biological father of the child, that his client wished to exercise his rights and responsibilities as a father, and that if the other side was interested in resolving the matter, both parties could certainly discuss a financial settlement. Renzo let him finish. Then he picked up the bottle, poured more wine into Travis's glass, and spoke while he poured. You moved into a new apartment at the beginning of the season, 4th floor, near the bus terminal. You borrowed the security deposit from a man named Mickey in Pawtucket. Travis's hand went rigid on the table. You made 3 payments on the car and then stopped. Last month, the finance company sent its second notice. Renzo set the bottle down. And I don't think Jess knows you weren't at her place Friday night. The man in the suit looked toward his client. Travis opened his mouth. At that moment, the door opened, and Adeline walked in. She moved slowly, one hand lightly supporting the underside of her growing belly, and she looked at Renzo before she looked at anyone else. Let me. Renzo leaned back in his chair. Adeline walked to the table, placed her phone in the middle of it, and pressed play. The room filled with the sound of rice bubbling on a stove, the sound of a door opening, then Travis's own voice, clear in every word, calm as though he were discussing taking out the trash, saying that he couldn't carry her entire family. Then came her voice asking, what about the baby? Then his answer, that is your problem. Adeline stopped the recording. She didn't say another word. The man in the suit closed his briefcase before his client even had time to stand. They walked toward the door, and Travis paused for 1 second on the front step as though he might turn back. Then he didn't, and that was the last time Adeline ever saw him. The hearing took place on a morning late in the season at the State Labor Commission building, in a room paneled with pale wood and several rows of folding chairs. Adeline arrived early. She wore the only coat that still fit her, the blue-covered notebook in one hand, and when she stepped into the room, she stopped at the doorway. The back rows were already full. Duffy sat in the middle with both hands resting on his thighs. The man who had been holding his cap on the apartment landing sat in the last row with his head lowered. There were several people she knew only by sight from the vehicle yard at shift change. There were even people who had left the company long ago and were working elsewhere now, wearing the uniforms of other companies, arriving and sitting down without saying a word to anyone. Rita sat in the front row with the envelope on her lap. Renzo sat in the second row beside the aisle, and he looked at no one but her. Across the room, Gerald Vance sat between 2 lawyers, his fountain pen placed in front of him, perfectly parallel with the edge of the paper. When Adeline was invited to speak, she stood. The presiding officer asked whether she would prefer to remain seated given her condition. She thanked him but said she would rather stand. She explained briefly how the deductions had been calculated. Her lawyer presented the comparison with the bills of lading from the outside transportation company. When it was the other side's turn, one of Vance's lawyers stood and said that all relevant internal company records had been properly sealed by court order, that what the complainant had presented amounted only to personal notes with no evidentiary value, and he used those exact words, personal notes. The presiding officer asked whether Adeline wished to add anything. She opened the notebook. Yes, I would like to read a list. Then she began. She read slowly, one name at a time, pausing after each one. She read the name of the man who had been charged for fuel used by the company's own vehicle for an entire summer. She read the name of the woman who had been charged for a uniform 3 times in 1 year. She read the name of the driver who had asked to miss a shift because of a storm and had been marked as failing to complete the shift. She read the names of people who had left the profession, who had gone on to drive buses, who had moved back home, who could no longer be reached. She read the name of a man who had died the year before, and she gave the date of his death. No one in the room moved. There was only her voice and the sound of pages turning. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, still looking down at the notebook. "On the payroll, these people do not have names. They have codes. The codes begin with the letter D, followed by a number. I am D412. She looked up. "This has been called personal notes, and that is exactly what it is. I wrote these things down because I had nothing else. But I would ask you to notice that through all those years, this was the only place where these people were still called by their names." She turned to the final page. "I would like to read one more name. This person didn't drive for the company. He worked at a construction site for a subcontractor, and he signed the same kind of agreement, with the same small print, making him responsible for himself." Her voice remained even. "Jonah Rourke, my younger brother." The presiding officer struck the gavel for silence, even though there was no sound in the room. The decision was announced 3 weeks later. The operating license of the new legal entity was suspended. The order also required repayment of every improper deduction, with interest, to each person whose name appeared on the list, and the entire file was referred to the state prosecutor's office for review of possible criminal liability. Zia Grazia fell ill during the very week the decision was announced. Only later did Adeline understand that Grazia hadn't fallen ill that week at all. She had simply stopped hiding it. Dr. Kovac came to examine her, and then sat for a long time in the hallway with Renzo. And the next day they set up a bed for her in a room downstairs, so she wouldn't have to go up and down the stairs. She refused to stay still. She still made people bring her baskets of beans so she could sort them. Still gave instructions about the kitchen. Still asked Adeline how many bowls she had managed to eat that day. Near the end, she lost weight quickly, and her voice grew softer, but her mind remained clear. One afternoon she told Adeline to close the door, then took her hand and placed a worn gold ring in her palm, the inside of the band polished smooth by years of wear. "Serafina's," she said. "I have kept it since that day." Adeline tried to give it back. Grazia closed her fingers around it. "Listen to me. Renzo doesn't know how to ask anyone for anything. No one taught him how. He only knows how to give, and then stay quiet." She drew a breath. "So you have to be the one who speaks first. Do you remember? You have to be the one who speaks first." She passed away early one morning. Quietly, the wooden beads still looped around her hand. Renzo sat beside her bed through the entire night before, and he didn't say a word to anyone for the next 3 days. The wedding was held the following month in the courtyard behind the church in Federal Hill, because Grazia had made them promise beforehand that they wouldn't postpone it because of her, and everyone knew there was no arguing with that woman even after she was gone. There were no printed invitations. Most of the guests were people from the neighborhood, and the people who had filled the back rows at the hearing. Duffy arrived first, wearing a suit that was too tight, standing awkwardly as though he had no idea what to do with his hands. The man who had been holding the cap on the apartment landing came too, bringing his 3 children dressed in their best clothes. Rita brought flowers, and she had been crying since before the ceremony even began. The bakery owner closed his shop for the entire day and made the cake himself, and he wouldn't take money from anyone, and no one dared offer it. Bruno stood at the far end of the courtyard in the shadows, and Renzo went all the way over to him and pulled him forward to the front row. At the head of the tables outside, one chair was left empty. In front of it sat a plate, the knife and fork aligned neatly, a water glass filled halfway, and on the plate was a serving of the pasta Grazia used to make, prepared exactly according to her recipe. No one explained it to anyone. No one sat in that place either. When the music began, Adeline stood at the end of the aisle holding her bouquet, preparing to walk alone as they had planned. When she heard the faint clatter of a metal frame behind her, she turned around. Jonah was sitting in his chair at the beginning of the aisle, and the aide beside him handed him the training frame. He gripped both sides. He drew in a breath. Then he pushed himself upward, and he stood. Adeline raised one hand to cover her mouth. He took the first step. The entire courtyard went silent. No one spoke. No one moved. The second step. The frame made a soft sound against the stone beneath it. The third step. The aide stayed close beside him but didn't support him. The fourth step. Sweat had begun to gather across his forehead, and his jaw was clenched. But he was still smiling. The same kind of smile he always wore in the therapy room when he was showing his sister something he had managed to do. The 5th step. The 6th. At the 7th, he stopped directly in front of her, released one hand from the frame, and held it out to her. "I told you not to start crying before I did." Adeline took her brother's hand. She couldn't say a word. The two of them walked the rest of the way together like that, very slowly, Jonah supporting himself on one side of the frame while she steadied the other, and the entire courtyard watched in silence until they reached the front. Then Rita pushed the chair in behind Jonah at exactly the moment he needed to sit, and he dropped into it, breathing hard, and only then did the courtyard break into applause. The ceremony was short. When the priest reached the exchange of rings, Adeline picked up the worn gold band and took Renzo's hand to slide it on, and in that moment, when her fingers touched his wrist, she realized there was nothing there anymore. The scratched watch was gone. All that remained was a narrow strip of skin slightly paler than the rest, exactly the width of a watch band, the kind of mark you would only notice if you were holding someone's hand. Adeline didn't ask. She had seen the transition plans spread across his desk for months, had heard the calls that lasted late into the night, had understood what it was costing him to bring everything into the light. She only tightened her grip on his hand a little, slid the ring into place, and lifted her eyes to him. Renzo looked back at her, and he didn't say anything either. Their daughter was born on a night near the end of the season, when rain had been falling since afternoon, and continued until morning. Dr. Kovac was there. Rita paced back and forth in the hallway, and Renzo held his wife's hand from beginning to end without managing to say a single sensible sentence. When the baby's first cry filled the room, he bent down to look at her, and Adeline saw his shoulders tremble once before becoming still. They named the little girl after two women, one he had lost when he was still a boy, and one who had only recently left them. That night, after the entire house had gone to sleep, Adeline sat beside the window holding her daughter and listening to the rain, and on the table beside her were several things Zia Grazia had left behind that she still hadn't finished going through. Among them was a worn leather notebook, the same one she had once seen Renzo place on the table during the meeting when the older men in the house objected to his plan to change everything, and that day he had read only one line from it before the entire room fell silent. She had never asked what was written inside. She opened it. The handwriting leaned across the page in ink that had faded to brown, dated more than half a century earlier. The old man had written that he had stood in the rain for 3 hours outside a large house that day, waiting for someone to come out and receive a delivery, that he had knocked, and someone had pulled back the curtain to look at him before letting it fall again, and that he had remained standing there because if he left, they would report to the company that he had failed to deliver. He wrote that he wasn't angry with them. He only found it strange, because opening a door didn't cost anything. Then he wrote one final line, and that line had been underlined in the same ink. He wrote that if he ever had anything of his own one day, he would open the door. Adeline read it again. She looked down at the small note in the corner of the page, where people usually wrote the name of their workplace, and there was the name of a delivery company that had disappeared long ago, along with the identification number of one delivery worker. She sat there for a very long time with her child in her arms and the sound of rain beyond the window. 1 year later, during the storm season, the bell at the Blackthorn Hill gate rang close to 9 o'clock at night. Adeline was feeding her daughter when she heard it. She set the little girl down, put on a coat, and went to open the door. Outside beneath the porch light stood a young woman soaked from head to toe, her rain hood plastered against her forehead, both arms wrapped around a package pressed tightly to her chest to keep it dry. She was out of breath and kept apologizing for being late, saying her vehicle was parked at the bottom of the hill because the road was flooded, saying she had walked the rest of the way, repeating the apology again and again as though she were afraid someone would scold her. Adeline looked at the young woman for a moment. Then she opened the door wider. "Come inside first," she said. "It is cold out there. There are lessons life teaches us only by making us lie down in the rain. No work is beneath dignity. Only the way people choose to look at another human being can be beneath dignity. And a person in a raincoat standing outside our door at 9 o'clock at night has a family waiting somewhere too, has a notebook filled with bills and responsibilities too, has a name and not merely a number." That night, 3 cars passed Adeline and only one stopped, but it turned out that one was enough to change an entire life. And the thing most worth remembering isn't who is rich and who is poor, but that there is still time for us to stop for one another. Still time to open a door. Still time to call a person by their real name. If today's story touched your heart, please Please leave a like and share this video with the people you love. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that every day there can be another story worth hearing. How do you feel about the story of Adeline and Renzo? And if you had been standing at that gate on that rainy night, what would you have done? Please write a few words in the comments, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish you and your family lasting good health, happiness, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.